Firstly is grand corruption, and this is essentially corruption that pervades the highest level of a national government, leading to a broad erosion of confidence in good governance, the rule of law, and economic stability. Then we have petty corruption, and this involves the exchange of very small amounts of money, the granting of minor favors by those seeking preferential treatment, or employment of friends and relatives in minor positions. Also, we have nepotism. This involves unfair favor towards relatives in such a way that instead of applying objective evaluation of the ability or suitability of the person or a corporation, it implies that the decision maker also has a conflict of interest. And then closely related to nepotism is favoritism, which involves the provision of services or resources according to personal affiliations, for instance, ethnic, religious, or even political party affiliations. And then we have abuse of power, and this involves using vested authority improperly to benefit or discriminate against another public servant, a person, or entity. Closely linked to that is abuse of discretion. In some cases, corruption can involve the abuse of a discretion which is vested in an individual for personal gain. Then we have conflict of interest, which involves an employee putting his or her own personal interest before the organizational best interest in a situation in which an individual is confronted with choosing between the duties and demands of his or her position and his or her own private interests. Then we have facilitation payments, which could usually be described as grease payments, and these are unofficial payments made to secure or expedite the performance of a routine or necessary action to which the payer of the facilitation payment has legal or other entitlement. Corruption is facilitated using various innovative ways and mechanisms such as the use of agents and intermediaries. And this occurs when a company appoints an agent or intermediary to act as a middleman in giving or receiving a bribe. Then we have bribery, which is perhaps the most common form of corruption that is known. And this involves the bestowing of a benefit in any form in order to unduly influence an action or decision. And then we have extortion, which is the process of forcing someone to do something by threatening them with negative repercussions in order to induce cooperation. Then we have embezzlement, and this involves the theft of resources by persons entrusted with the authority over and control over such resources. Closely linked to that is fraud, which is the unlawful intentional making of a mere representation that causes actual or potential damage or harm to another person or company. Then we have the evasion of tax and relevant duties. And it's important to understand that there's a difference between the evasion of tax and the avoidance of tax. Avoiding tax may be legal, but evasion of tax would constitute a crime. Then we have money laundering. And this simply is a process by which criminals attempt to conceal the illegal origin and illegitimate ownership of property and assets that are the fruits or proceeds of their criminal activities. Interestingly, improper political contributions can amount to corruption. And in this regard, we mean donations made with the intention or the expectation that the party will, once in office, favor the interests of the donor over the interest of the public, which is essentially tantamount to the payment of a bribe. Another interesting facet of corruption that particularly links to the whole tender and procurement processes is cover quoting or bid rigging. For example, where a procurement officer colludes with external suppliers who submit multiple quotes and thereby are assured of being granted a contract, that essentially is corruption. And this could also occur when one individual or entity submits tenders for the supply of goods or services to multiple companies that they are involved with. This is also closely related to anti-competitive practices that could also include price fixing. When competitors enter into an agreement to keep prices at a specific level, which normally therefore then results in a higher cost to the consumer, or where competitors collude during the tendering process to, for instance, agree not to enter into each other's markets. Closely associated with this, or in the same vein, insider trading is another type of corruption, and this involves the use for personal gain of privileged information and knowledge that the person possesses as a result of his or her position. Corruption has a very negative impact on the enabling environment for private sector growth and competitiveness on the continent.
The sad part about corruption is that it impacts most of the poor. Especially in developing countries, it's the poor people who don't have access to resources, who don't have access to water, to food, to electricity, who are affected by corruption. So the added costs of corruption, the added cost that corruption results in doing business in the country, deprives the communities of that additional house that could have been built, or that additional well or tap that could have been built for water, and that's a shame. It makes everything more expensive. If you look at corruption in isolation as something that's part of the landscape and that's the way we do business and that's the way things happen, we will never ever solve this problem. We need leaders to adopt a zero-tolerance approach to corruption and to lead from the front. We need ethical and responsible leadership. You need leaders who are courageous, who are willing to tackle corruption head-on, and we can trust them to then put in place the institutional framework to deal with corruption effectively. One pillar of this institutional framework is transparency, and we need mechanisms to make sure that everything that is done, especially in some of the areas that are vulnerable, state tenders, procurement, some of the construction contracts, there is as much transparency as possible, so that there's open processes for bids, that bids are evaluated and adjudicated in a way that's credible and transparent, and that when the winning bidders are announced, even that is done in a transparent way.